So next up, Steve is going to give us a little talk called Means Matter, How to Achieve Your Values. Steve?
Thanks, Chris. So what I'd like to talk about today is it's a topic it's something a little bit more topical than usual. I want to talk about the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. But I'm not going to go into the details of this legislation. Instead, I want to use the debate that we're being forced to have about healthcare right now as a teaching point to illustrate what I'd call the psychology of government. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to tell you the story of a hypothetical person. We'll call him Joe. And I'm going to tell you who Joe is, and then I'm going to show two distinct timelines that his life takes, two parallel universes, you could say. And the point in his timeline that where it splits is a key decision he makes early in his life about deciding what means he's going to use to achieve a goal of his, a passion of his, which is universal health care. So he cares about universal health care, and at this early point in his life, he says, how am I going to go about achieving it? That's why the title of my talk is Means Matter. And just so there's no suspense, the outcome is going to be, of course, that when he chooses to use government, he's going to find that it turns bad. And when he chooses to use voluntary means to achieve universal health care, it turns out better. But so that's the main takeaway. But another thing I want people to sort of get from the speech is that we need to build mental constructs. We need to clearly understand the psychology of people, why they choose to use government, why they decide to use voluntary means, so that we understand what's going on. And when we are debating with them or having discussions with them, we understand their psychology. And so that hopefully that's Joe's story will draw out. Okay, so like I said, Joe is somebody who cares very passionately about affordable health care for everyone. Now, why he has that passion is not super important, but I'd like to give you some things that might be the reason, just so you can start to understand who he is. It could be that when Joe was 8 years old, he remembers being in his grandmother's hospital room, and she was dying from cancer. And he remembers her crying while she's trying to haggle with her insurance companies to convince them to pay for her treatment, because she's crying because she's afraid she's going to leave healthcare bills behind for her children. And Joe saw this as an 8-year-old and said, "This is something's wrong with the world." Now, this is a story that Obama has actually told as he was selling Obamacare. This is something that happened to him. Or it could have been that Joe, when he was young, let's say his mother got a unexpected brain aneurysm or heart condition, and she didn't have insurance, and this was totally unexpected. But as a result of this happening, they had to place a mortgage on their house, or they had to even move into less affordable housing. And Joe, as a young person, saw this and said, "This is an injustice. This type of thing should not happen." Or it could have been when Joe was in high school or college, he took a class on, and he read a study that showed a huge percentage of bankruptcies are caused by unanticipated healthcare expenses. So and the study profiled some of these people, hardworking, followed the rules, otherwise upstanding citizens who all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, have to incur these unbelievably high health care expenses and then have to declare bankruptcy. And again, his sense of justice was outraged when he saw this. So Joe goes into his adult life with a passion, a head full of steam. This is the mark he wants to make in the world. And he wants to try to bring affordable care to everyone. So he graduates college, he works for a couple of years, he starts to learn how to negotiate in the world and maneuver. And at some point he says, okay, now I have to go start getting on with this goal that I have of making this universal health care a reality. So he spends some time researching it, He researches the healthcare field and talks to people who have theories about how to solve it, and perhaps he studies some economics, and he comes up with a plan. Now, the details of the plan are not important, so I don't want you to get hung up on that, but I'll just give you the outline. The basic idea is he's going to create a fund, and they're going to get subsidized services from some different kinds of healthcare providers, and they're going to offer subsidies or even straight out grants to people who can't afford it. So this is an outline of his plan. Now we come to the critical decision point in his life, which is, you notice I haven't mentioned how he's going to fund this plan and how he's going to get buy-in from all of the healthcare providers. Now, let's say we're going to split it off now into the first scenario. Let's say in the first scenario, Joe's a member of the Church of Praxeology. He's grown up. This message has been repeated over and over. The government is a criminal organization. It's illegitimate. It doesn't solve any of these problems. And so he says, I have this plan. I believe in universal health care, but I'm not going to try to bring it about in using the government. And so he decides this is going to be completely voluntary. So let's see what happens with that in that scenario. So there's something going on with Joe that he's probably not aware of at this point, which is he has limited knowledge of the world. His understanding of the healthcare industry is limited. His understanding of how other people act, their motivations is limited, and his experience in life is limited. So his knowledge is limited, but he's not aware of it. And as he goes out, he's very quickly going to come up against those limitations as he goes out and tries to sell his plan. And we're going to see what happens, but he's going to find out that people have different viewpoints. People have different perspectives. And what I've done is try to distill 3 distinct types of sort of composite characters, and I've given them names, but they're composite. I mean, they represent a lot of people. But just to give you some ideas of the kinds of objections Joe runs up against as he's trying to sell this healthcare plan to them. So the first type of objection comes from somebody, let's call him Al. Now, Al is hardworking and pretty thoughtful, but Al has one objection to Joe when Joe comes and says, here's my solution. Al says, why should I care? Why should I care about other people who can't afford health care? I mean, that's not... And at first, Joe just doesn't even know what to say, but as he keeps getting these reactions from people like Al, he becomes angry, and he becomes almost, he's like, Al's selfish, Al has this very little world, and he wants to make it comfortable, and he doesn't care about anyone else. And he doesn't say that's legitimate. He says, here's the thing, I can't deal with the Als of the world. They're not going to help solve this problem. So he kind of pushes it aside, and he says, what I need to do is I need to find people who very obviously care about other people. And so he goes out and starts looking for them, and he's going to try and get them on board to support his plan. And he starts finding people like that. And one type of person that he finds like that we'll call Barb. Now, Barb very clearly cares about other people. She's somebody who will give to charity. She contributes. And so when Joe first discovers her, he's like, perfect, I can work with Barb. But the problem with Barb is she's not systematic in her charity. She's not methodical. She's not organized. She doesn't follow like any kind of rational rule or theory of justice or anything. So Barb's the type of person, she'll give money to somebody she sees on Oprah who had to sell her house because of healthcare costs. Or, she'll give money to people on the street who ask, or maybe if she sees a natural disaster on the news, she'll give. So, I mean, she cares, but she doesn't intellectualize it. She doesn't think about why she's giving. And so when Joe comes to her, Joe comes sort of with an attitude of, you're doing it wrong. He comes to her, and maybe he doesn't say this, but his approach is, there's, this healthcare is a right. Healthcare is, it's an injustice that's going on here, and you're giving this money, but you're not doing it systematically. And if you come along with my plan, we can affect a more positive change. And this kind of throws Barb off, And to the extent that Barb verbalizes her objection, and not Barb in Barb's other world, like I said, it's a composite character. To the extent that she verbalizes it, she says, Joe, why should I think about this stuff? I mean, I like how I live my life. You know, when I see a problem, I help, and, you know, it makes me feel good. And, you know, I don't really like you criticizing that. And Joe gets really upset with this, and he eventually decides, I can't deal with the Barbs of the world either. They're not going to help me solve, they're not going to be part of this plan. He says, what I need to do is find people who care about people and who are really thoughtful and think this stuff through. And so those are going to be my power rally. Those are going to be the people who really make this charity a reality. So he starts looking for them, and he finds people like that. And he finds people like, we'll call him Kurt. Now, everyone knows people like Kurt. Kurt is really thoughtful and cares about people and very rational and methodical. But Kurt is skeptical. And so when Joe first meets him, he's like, this is somebody I can deal with. But as he starts selling his plan, Kurt starts coming up with all these objections. He says, to the extent that he verbalizes his objections, he says, you know, why should I trust them? How do I know that these people are worthy? How do I know that these people, you know, aren't cheating? How do I know that they're not telling you that they don't have money, but they do? Or what about your employees? What kind of controls are you going to put around the dispute, how they disperse the funds? And Joe's kind of, you know, he's kind of, at first he doesn't know what to say, but as he keeps running into the Kurts of the world, he starts saying, the problem with Kurt is he thinks everyone's trying to screw him. He thinks everyone has an angle. And, you know, he's so cynical. And I don't think I can work with Kurt because, you know, he thinks everyone's against him. So what happens is now Joe's, this is a sort of a critical turning point in his path. He realizes there's basically no one else to appeal to. I mean, in other words, the only people now who he could really try to reach out to get help to build his charity are clones of him, people who have the exact same knowledge of the world, people who have the exact same approach. And so what happens is the gap between where Joe thinks his charity is going to be and where it actually turns out is so wide that even he has to realize it's not going to work. And so it kind of collapses. And this is an emotionally very traumatic period for Joe, because what happens is all of these objections and all of these objections are now hitting home, and all of his assumptions he now has to reevaluate, and it's painful. Maybe people have been through that before, you know, something similar. I mean, this is no one enjoys these episodes, and so what happens is now Joe has to give a real day in court to all these objections that people have given him, and actually say maybe they're legitimate. So you notice as he went through all the objections, he kind of pushed the people aside. You know, now he's actually got to say maybe they have something worthwhile. Maybe they have a good point of view. So he says, like, take Al. He says, you know, maybe Al's got a good point. Maybe why should I care? Why should we care about these people? You know, and then he says, well, maybe what I need to do is I need to show Al how to improve the limited world he's worried about. I have to find a way to show him that there's a larger world that it's part of, and so it matters to him that people don't have health care. And then he thinks about Barb's objections, and he says, you know, Barb, it's not how I live my life, but it's actually like I can understand how she enjoys her life. I mean, she helps people when she sees them, and maybe what I need to do is show Barb that what I'm trying to do here is actually complementary to what she's doing. And if she can get on board with this, then it would actually be a much more, she might even get more satisfaction out of helping me. And with Kurt, he says, actually, you know, Kurt, he's more cynical than me, but he's got some good points. How do I know people aren't going to cheat me on the charity? How do I know that, you know, my employees are going to be acting out of the same sense of mission? So this is, like I said, it's a painful process for him. As often personal growth is painful, and maturation is something people a lot of times resist, because you want to hold on to the sort of, I'd say, conceits of your childhood, and you want to think that you know everything, and you know, but because Joe chose the voluntary path, he's forced to actually think about this, and sort of there's this process of ego deflation. And things start getting better for Joe now because he's gone through this process. And what happens is he has a choice now. He has to say, do I even believe in this universal health care in the first place? And maybe he doesn't. Maybe he says, that was kind of a childish dream I had, and everyone has told me that it's not something I should care about, so he goes on and chooses a different path in life, which is good, because a lot of people have fanciful notions, and then when they start thinking them through, they don't work out. But let's assume that Joe says, despite everything I've heard, despite all the objections I've heard, I still remember these things that happened to me in my childhood, and it's worthwhile, this cause. And so I need to find a way to make it happen. So he starts tweaking his plan. He starts adding all of the knowledge that he's getting from people, the feedback he's getting, and he builds this much more intricate, kind of responsive, flexible, and plan that satisfies all of the objections and all the different personality types. And what happens is this plan that he builds, it's this sort of almost crystalline structure with all these different facets and everything. But it's a expression of the values of the community. It's all the people in the community. All of their knowledge is going into this, and it's creating this thing that really matches sort of what they want. And Joe himself is changing. Joe himself is becoming more nuanced and becoming more potent of force to realize the values that this value he has. And so he himself is able to actually affect what he wants much more effectively. And as time goes on, what happens is this charity becomes a source of pride for the entire community. Everyone, because it's voluntary, everyone gets on board with it. Even if they don't contribute, at least they like it. And they wear it as a badge of pride. They say in our community, nobody goes without health care. And nobody's against it. Everyone's happy that he's doing it. And Joe himself he's actually helping people. And it's a very emotionally satisfying for him that he's doing this thing that's good. And he may never get to universal health care. He might not give his charity might not get big enough to help millions of people. But maybe he helps 100, maybe he helps thousands, And it's still something good has come out. Something really real and good has been accomplished by his, and so it turns out to be a happy life for Joe, because he chose the voluntary path, despite the initial turbulence and problems he had. So that's the first possible timeline for Joe. Now I want to go back and show what happens if instead, when he's young and he has this idea of universal health care, he decides to use the government to solve it. So now we're going back, and Joe is, let's say he has sort of more conventional political views. He thinks government is sometimes okay to use government for these types of things. Now, if he's smart and when he surveys the landscape of his future, and he says, I could go out and voluntarily, step by step, try and build this thing. Or there's this huge organization called the state that, if I can capture it, will give me the ability to scale my idea on millions. Even within my own life, millions of people could maybe be living my dream. Well, if he's smart, he's going to choose the political path. Because it's so tempting for him. So let's assume he does that. So he goes into politics. He's going to try and get some political power to affect this change. And the first thing he learns in politics is the number one cardinal rule of politics, which is you have to win. If you don't win, you can't do anything. So despite whatever all of these politicians are telling themselves, they're in it for all these other reasons, their actions are actually show them doing whatever they need to do to win. And further, the corollary is that in a democratic system, to gain power, what you have to do is to get backers. Before you get the power, before you can do the plan, you have to get backers. And so Joe goes out with he still wants to bring about this universal health care, but he goes around and sells this not to the people who are going to pay for it, but to the people who are going to benefit from it, and gets them on board. And so he's building this organization, he's building his base, and let's say he starts moving up the ranks in politics. And eventually he sort of, you could say, like, metaphor, like crests the hill, and he comes to a position, maybe he's a governor or maybe he's, president or whatever, where he can actually implement his plan. Now the important thing to remember is that he's got people pushing him from behind. All of his backers have already bought on his plan. He can't just totally transform it and change it and respond. And so it's a very different in nature from, you remember when he was doing this voluntarily, it was almost like he's putting his toe in the water, he's feeling it, and he's going forward. But with politics, it's people are pushing him, so he has to sort of impose this. Now he wants everyone to agree with him, of course, but if they don't agree with him, then what he really wants them to do is at least be silent. He wants them to silence their objections. So so the Al and Barb and Kurtz of the world are still out there. They still have the same objections. But in this case, he realizes he's got these new tools that politics gives him to silence people's objections, and he's going to utilize them to implement his plan. So with Al, he says, Al's selfish. What I can do is I can bribe him. And I can just say, Al, I'll give you this great health care, and you just pay a little bit, but I don't want to hear your objections about why should I care about people, Now this is something he can't do in the voluntary marketplace. I mean, you can't bribe somebody and expect to get more back. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You can only do that when there's this pool of money that other people are forced to contribute to, and so you can now utilize bribery. So that's how he deals with the Als of the world. Then there's Barb. Now he knows that Barb is sort of emotional, and he realizes, what I can do with Barb is I can lie to Barb. I can tell her, I can connect with her emotions and tell her that my plan is, solving her concerns, and as long as I can convince her long enough to implement this plan, then it's too late. She can't, even she finds out later, it doesn't matter because it's already law, it's already been established. Again, not something you can do in the voluntary marketplace, because if you lie to someone in the voluntary marketplace, yes, he might get away with it initially, but somebody's going to tip him off or tip her off, or she's going to discover it, and the second that happens, his reputation is gone. She's going to withdraw support. So you can't lie like that in the voluntary marketplace. But in politics, you can get away with it. Now he has the problem of Kurt. Now Kurt, he knows he can't bribe Kurt, and he knows he can't lie to Kurt. Kurt's too smart for that. But what he can say to Kurt, he can threaten Kurt. He can say, Kurt, I know you care about this stuff, and I know you have objections or whatever, but this is the best plan we've got. If we don't go with this, then the other parties or the other guys are going to do nothing. So let's at least, I know it's not perfect, but let's at least withdraw your objection. Again, he can't do that in the voluntary marketplace. You're not representing a political party. If I go to you and try to sell something to you in the voluntary marketplace, I can't say I'm displacing another politician. It's just, so all of these three things, bribing, lying, threatening, these are only things that can come about as when you're part of a political organization. And it's important to realize all three of these things are designed to suppress the expression of knowledge. They're designed to suppress people's objections, to get them to swallow their objections. And so what happens with Joe in this timeline, it gets worse. It gets worse and worse as time goes on. Because what happens is even if he gets his plan implemented, his plan is still the original crude plan or some modification of it, but it's not an expression of the community. And so it doesn't actually achieve the goals. And it's resented by a lot of people. And Joe's resented by a lot of people. And although he might have his picture on the magazines and he might get applause from his backers, it doesn't ring true. It's not emotionally satisfying to them. And Joe becomes increasingly resentful. He thinks people are unappreciative of what he's done, and they are. And so it's sort of a mean life. And the thing is, he never went through that difficult process that in the voluntary world he was forced to go through of coming to terms with the fact that everyone has their own ideas, everyone has their own approaches, and they have to be respected, and you have to acknowledge them. So that's sort of my, I just want to conclude with a couple takeaways here. The main point I'm trying to get across is that when you do something in the voluntary world, what you create becomes an expression of the community, and it is integrating the accumulated knowledge of everyone in the community because it's voluntary. When you do something in politics, it's the opposite. The community is suppressed, the knowledge of the community is suppressed, and it's an imposition of one or a few people, their delusion or illusion about what should be on the community. And the second thing is that I want to draw out here is that beyond what the consequences are to the community, Joe himself, the individual himself who's involved in politics, the individual himself who sees politics as a solution, is hurt and suffers from choosing that path, because at root what it's saying is, you remember Joe in the voluntary world, when anytime there was an objection, he'd just kind of throw it aside, like, well, I can't work with that, I can't, Well, when you take the political path, what you're doing is basically, that's how you're living. You're, in a real sense, staying immature, staying in a all these politicians, to a real sense, in a certain sense, are really like emotionally immature. It's this idea that other people don't think, other people need to be taken care of, other people don't need to be consulted upon, and so it's bad for them. It's bad for them because they live like in this immature life. And we all know going through the hard process of becoming mature is difficult, but it's good for you in the long run. And just one final thing, the two scenarios of Joe's life the parable that I tried to lay out here, I tried to distill the essences. It's not, life is dirtier, life is more complex, obviously. And so there are, and Joe's life had this one split when he was young, but the reality is there's all kinds of choices we make in our life. There's all kinds of different directions. Right now, there's a million different possible timelines for your life. If you have new ideas, if you have new ways of thinking, and it's not just choosing certain things, it's also how you think. So I just thought maybe we could just now that I'm done, if we want to take a minute just to contemplate, I just take a minute to think about, do you agree with the representations I made? Like, do you think that it rings true? And if it does, what does that change about maybe something you thought about your life, or thoughts you have, or if there's a pending decision that you have to make, does it have any impact on that? So let's just take a minute here, and then Justin's going to talk.